Too many people fall into just talking about what they do versus what problem they're solving for the customer. If you're into that broader world, helping get elevated voices from manufacturing into things, direction of our country, realize what that takes and how much more work.
The Industrial Growth Institute podcast connects you with the big thinkers, makers, and subject matter experts across all aspects of an integrated B2B industrial revenue growth function. From strategy, board oversight and transactions, through all the phases of manufacturing marketing, the complexities of industrial sales, and the nuances of marketing and sales technology and customer experience, I speak with guests who bring insights, innovative perspectives, best practices, and twists on traditional approaches. Each episode explores high-level thinking and in-the-weeds actionable tactics. If you enjoyed these discussions, then please help me out by liking and sharing the podcast, and especially by leaving a comment and giving a review. So with no further ado, let's jump into this episode. There are a lot of powerful influencers doing a lot of great work to help spread the word about the virtue of manufacturing. And today's episode of the Industrial Growth Institute podcast is focused on one man's really tireless work helping to tell the story of manufacturing. I'm Ed Marsh, your host, and today I'm thrilled to welcome Jim Vinoski to the studio. Jim is an industry executive who has remained active on what he calls the front lines of manufacturing throughout his 38-year career. He's helped companies from big to small, including companies names you'll recognize like Purina and General Mills, improving their manufacturing operations. But he's also had hands-on roles in making products, ranging from food to plastics and even paint to bourbon. He's a speaker. He's the author of 2 books. His first book, We Need One of These, How Academic Robotics Teams Enhance Public Education and Change Kids' Lives, that's a mouthful of a title, told the story of how one of the world's most accomplished robotics teams helped with those goals and much more. His second book is going to be published soon. It's titled Inspiring Industry. It's going to tell the stories of unsung heroes in U.S. production. But you probably recognize his name. You may not remember from where, but if you recognize his name, it's probably because you've read his Forbes column or caught an episode of his Manufacturing Talks web show and podcast that chronicle today's most important news and innovations and feel-good stories in what he calls the nowhere to hide industrial world. Jim is outspoken about our need to promote manufacturing among our youth and to actively develop the industrial workforce for the future. He's the president of his own industrial advisory firm, Cosgrove Content and Consulting. He and his family live in the heart of industrial America in Michigan. He's an avid bicyclist. He's a history buff. And he's a guy who has a lot to say about manufacturing. So I'm looking forward to this conversation. Hit the bell while you're listening. Share this episode with folks who share our mutual passion for manufacturing. With that, welcome, Jim. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Ed. It's great to be here.
All right. I want to start with a topic that's near and dear to my heart. I'm a veteran, and I tend to be a sucker for stories about programs for veterans. So your recent discussion with Mike Rowe about his partnership with Pure Talk to help vets get education, skill trades, caught my interest. Not only, obviously, is Mike Rowe a marquee name and a huge advocate for manufacturing, Pure Talk is an interesting company I hear advertised, but don't hear a lot about. And so this strikes me as a fascinating program. Talk about how you got involved with it and what you learned about it.
Okay. Well, before I talk, thank you, Ed, for your service and for helping keep me and my family safe through your efforts.
Thank you.
I'm not a veteran, but I have the utmost respect for guys like you and the women alongside who've sacrificed part of their lives to keep our nation the free and viable entity it's been here for hundreds of years now. So anything I can do to help veterans, I'm more than happy to sign up. So it was just an absolute honor and joy to partner up with Mike and with Pure Talk to talk about what they're doing to advocate trades for former service members.
Well, thanks for the kind words.
It was interesting.
Tell us about it.
Yeah. So Mike himself put it best. He's like, he got tied up with these guys through some sponsorship stuff for his new show. And he himself said, you don't think about a wireless outfit, number one, being at all involved in trades. And then number two, it's not obvious what their veterans' involvement would be, but it turns out they're a veteran-led company. So that's where that passion and advocacy originates. And then they just saw what Mike was doing and decided, this is a perfect avenue for, supporting our peers in the veteran community. And they realized the tie, and Mike did too, about what trades and military vets just naturally have in common. So it progressed from there. And now they're partnered up, talking it up and getting money flowing to veterans to go into skilled trades. And
the program basically sponsors education for transitioning veterans who are interested in skilled trades?
It's really tied in with the MicroWorks Foundation, which Mike established after his successful run at Dirty Jobs, where he had gotten that passion for what people do in the hands-on work of making our country run,
right.
What they go through, what they experience, and what they need. And of course, obviously realizing that we face this triple whammy around not having the people, not having the skills, and having this big gap
right.
Between the last generation that had trades and manufacturing jobs held out as a positive career option, and that was the baby boomers, who are now either already retired or fast retiring in droves.
Well, thank you for using your platform to help tell that story and to talk about manufacturing. If we back up a bit, I want to emphasize the fact, I think it ought to be clear from your bio, but you're not some finance guy who decided to support manufacturing because you felt guilty after shipping a bunch of jobs overseas for years. You spent 30 years on factory floors, 15 years at General Mills, several years modernizing a bourbon distillery, 10 years in the dairy business. Give us the short version of your experience as a plant engineer, plant manager, and manufacturing consultant to give us that context and credibility.
Yeah, it's a two-sided coin for sure. Anyone who's gone through it knows, number one, there's nothing to compare around having meaningful work happening every single day that you're on the job, and having new and exciting things happening. It's just a challenge. It's where you're never going to be bored. You're never going to lack for things to do, and you're never going to.
Although some days you may wish you could be.
Right? Pardon?
Some days you may wish you could just be a little bit bored today.
Well, and that's the flip side, because like you said in the intro, there's no hiding in the manufacturing world.
Right.
You're either making stuff and making it efficiently enough where the price that you have to get, you get from a willing consumer. And so you miss on any of that, you're going out of business.
Right.
And so it's to me, I call it the crucible of the business world. And I've had those moments like you were alluding to, where I'm standing there thinking there's got to be a better way to make a living, right? But then I realized, as I got to, 2 decades, 25 years plus doing this, how I was still revved up to be on the floor, to talk to folks who are doing the tough work,
right?
And how much of a blessing it had been through, at that point, most of my working life. And now I'm expanding on what I can do to not only play it up for people coming behind me, but also bring back more of those jobs.
Sure.
We let too many of them go, and we made some really dumb policy decisions, and we need to reverse course and be, I was going to say, be makers again. That's not really true. We were never not makers. We just let a lot of it go, and we need to get a lot of that back.
And in August of 2018, you decided you were going to step forward. You were still working your day job or day and night job, 60-hour-a-week job, whatever it typically is in manufacturing. But you got your first byline on Forbes talking about manufacturing. How did that come about?
Yeah, I say it was the hand of God, because I had long been very involved on LinkedIn. I just found it to be a marvelous place to meet people who either were like-minded and enjoyed having discussions like we're having today, or people who wanted to know more or had an interest and just really casting the net wide to start that advocacy. And one day I'm on LinkedIn, and a recruiter I'm connected with reposted a post from one of his recruiter friends out west. And she just said, I'm helping a New York City friend of mine. She needs someone who can write magazine-length articles about manufacturing. Here's my email address if you want to know more. And, I'd always been a writer, but never professionally, never formally. I had a few things published in, like Plant Engineering Magazine, right, or some of the IEEE magazines that were there over the years. always did some writing. I had my own newsletter, an underground newsletter at General Mills for 10 or 12 years. That was interesting. And so I shot her a note and said, here's what I've done. Here's a few things online. I'd love to learn more. And within an hour, she comes back and says, I've looked at your stuff online. It looks phenomenal to me. I'm copying Amy Feldman at Forbes. You two take it from here.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
It was wow. And it was, okay, well, that's not going to happen. Forbes, that's crazy. But before I could even do anything, Amy, who became my first editor, followed up with me and said, yeah, I've seen some of your stuff. It looks promising. Get me some more samples that are closer to what we do in the manufacturing pages at Forbes, and then let's talk next week. So I did, got her some samples from technical stuff I'd done, and we got on the phone a week later and talked for about 45 minutes. She asked me what I wanted to write about, and I said, primarily, I want to write about what we do as American manufacturers, because there's so many people out there who think we don't manufacture things anymore. And at the end of 45 minutes, she says, okay, well, this is great. I'm sending you a contract.
Wow.
Yeah. And so,
and now one of those things where 7 years, 200 articles and 1.5 million page views later, you're still doing it.
Yeah. It has been just the most amazing blessing. So yeah, when people talk about being ready when opportunity knocks, I was one lucky cat to be ready for that one.
Of course, they also say that I forget all the specific expressions, but basically you're available for that opportunity because of everything you were doing before that. You were doing writing, you're on LinkedIn, and your mention of LinkedIn jumped out at me because I'm so sick and tired of hearing our industry is different. Our targets, in other words, plant engineers, plant managers, aren't on LinkedIn. They're not 25-year-old marketing people. And I'm sure that's true. I look at some profiles, some are missing, some are, haven't been touched in 15 years. But increasingly with generational change, that's not the case. And many of them are on Reddit. Many of them are in other places that people just say, they've got these, they project their own biases and they miss opportunities.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And certainly, there are those cases where you can see that people my age might be lagging on the technology front or the engagement front, but broadly speaking, no, everyone's kind of being pulled along by this technological and technical revolution that we're going through. So I've certainly never struggled to make contact with people I needed to through those outlets.
So writing for Forbes, well, you had your underground newsletter, then writing for Forbes were kind of first steps into the content space, but you took a couple bold steps in 2021. At the beginning of the year, you launched your copywriting business, Cosgrove Content, and in September that year, you launched your podcast, Manufacturing Talks. So you are now suddenly plunging headfirst while still working that day job, plunging headfirst into content. Talk about both of those ventures.
Yeah, I should mention I was also scoutmaster for our scout troop, so boredom was definitely not a problem.
Sleep was probably a problem.
Fortunately, I'm not a big TV watcher. I'm not a big sports guy, so I'm blessed to have a little more time than a lot of folks have. But yeah, so the writing company arose because of my Forbes work. I had people reaching out to me saying, hey, we're a manufacturing company or a consultancy, and we just struggle to find someone who can write content, who gets what we do and can present it in a way the general audience understands. And we see you doing that at Forbes. You want to give it a shot. And so I had a few clients pop up in the early years just from that. I didn't have to go sell myself. It just kind of naturally funneled to me. So that's where I first established my LLC and got that going. And then, later that year, I had seen other people doing the web shows, YouTube shows, and podcasts. Not a lot out of manufacturing, but I started to see a few folks out there who were getting going on that. And I just thought, I already have all these stories. At that point, I had, probably between 50 and 100 articles. I already talked to all these people who have great stories. Great that it's in Forbes, but a lot of people don't read those articles. So here's another avenue to get them out there. And that's what I started with, was just going back to people I had already written about and saying, hey, you want to jump on this new show I've got and talk about what we talked about a year or two ago? And so that got me out of the gates with, not a lot of extra work.
Right. But very consistent. I mean, now you're 4 years into it with weekly episodes, and I couldn't see where you had missed a week along the way.
Many. No, it's one thing. It's kind of funny. It goes back to that underground newsletter. I held it out as my own personal value to have that go out on whatever time basis, and it changed over the years. It was weekly, then it was every other week, something like that. But always, always, always hit those publication dates because I'd seen so many things just go by the wayside where people let a week go by and then a month would go by. And then, you're into 3-6 months, one's not gone out and you just give it up.
Yeah, it's almost
So
embarrassing to restart it at that point. So people say, well, I'll do something different.
Yep. So, again, kind of learned from the experience of others and held that value for myself. And I've done that with everything since then. And so, I guess the interesting thing with manufacturing talks is I started it as really that, alignment with my Forbes stories, and the two have kind of separated from each other now. Just kind of went naturally. Some of the stories that seem to fit a lot better with one medium don't really fit well with the other, and so they kind of select their own.
So that's a really interesting point. You've developed this, we call it a sixth sense, or maybe kind of a contextual understanding of how content lands or how it doesn't land. What do you think is the most common mistake that industrial manufacturers make in their content creation?
Not understanding the audience. I think
you mean just talking about themselves?
Right. Yeah. We're geeks, right? And so we kind of think everyone else is going to be a geek and be interested in the things we're interested in. And it's not really the case. And there's nothing wrong with that. If you want to target a purely geeky manufacturing audience, that's fine. You're just not going to get big numbers. And so realizing what you want to do with the show and what that requires, I think, is a big piece. And the thing I would say, though, is, I went into that certainly not knowing up front, and I've just kind of evolved with it as I learned. Right. So the other piece of it is you're never going to have all that knowledge to be able to launch in, full expert mode.
Sure.
So a little research up front, a little targeting of what you want to do, and then get rolling.
But that point you make about the marketing content applies to sales too, because what I see is industrial salespeople are, geeks. We like talking about the thousandths of an inch and the pounds per square inch and the horsepower and all that kind of stuff. And so the naturally comfortable conversation is with the technical buyer, the plant engineer who wants to have that conversation. Yeah. The problem is that often they're not the ones that hold the budget. They're not the ones making the business decision. And we have to have both of those conversations in content and in person as salespeople. And many companies struggle with that.
Yeah. Companies and people, right. It's that recent show I had was with a strategy guru who actually was a peer of mine at General Mills. I was unaware of him for most of the time because he was in the marketing world and I was in the manufacturing world, but we started the same year and now he's got his own strategy consultancy, Peter McDonald. And we were talking about a completely different topic of, should CPG companies get rid of their manufacturing like Coke largely did. And he made the point of you need to know where your value is created. Right. And so companies that make the move to not manufacture oftentimes kind of shoot themselves in the foot because they've just outsourced where their consumer value is created. Right. And I think it's the same way for those of us in manufacturing. You have to understand what drives the business end to be effective. You can geek out all day and spend a lot of money for not a lot of return if you're not looking at those business results that you want to deliver.
You've got something on your Cosgrove site. It's like a GIF that shows dairy bottles on a conveyor, and your caption says, "We can even make this interesting." I thought that was a great example of the way to think about it. So many companies say, "Well, nobody wants to read about that," or everyone knows that, and that's not the case.
It is kind of funny what sparks the general audience, and it's not always what you think it'll be. Right. I can tell you, I gave a lot of tours in my time in the dairy world of dairy processing plants, and the place where the bottles are made, the blow molders, would always be a highlight for anybody of any background. It's like they would just park themselves in front of the blow molder and watch those bottles fly out. And I wouldn't have guessed that up front, but I sure took advantage of it once I realized it.
Sure. So underlying all of your content, underlying most of the work you do these days, and a lot of the we're going to talk more about policy, but a lot of the policy thinking and writing that you do is really this theme of reindustrializing the U.S., reinvigorating and celebrating manufacturing here. So obviously you came from that manufacturing background, but there's a lot of people that come out of manufacturing that don't get out in front of everyone talking about it all the time. What prompted you to become so vocal and energetic about it?
Well, it's kind of interesting because it really started as separate threads. So I've also always been very interested in politics personally since the very beginning of my adult life. And I'm a staunch conservative leaning libertarian. I've read a lot of the Austrian economists, that kind of thing. And they were very separate pursuits for most of my time. And then it was really in the last 5 to 10 years as I looked at the reality of what was going on in manufacturing and then some of the ideals held out from my kind of political leanings and realized, there are things that aren't coming together here. I was a staunch free trader and defended NAFTA and some of those early moves to kind of open up global markets. And I still believe as an ideal that that's the way to go, but we don't live in an ideal world. And so having those come together and realizing, there are policy reasons that we are 0.04% of global shipbuilding now, or that we make 3% of the apparel we wear here in America. There are things in free trade in some areas of manufacturing that not just don't work, they've utterly destroyed whole swaths of industry.
Right.
And to not realize that, to hold out the ideal and continue to quote, Hayek and Mises at people and think that's going to fix things is kind of wrong-headed.
Right. Yeah, there's definitely the reality. You have to address both the theory and the reality.
Yep.
I'm also thinking, so you launched your writing business, you were working your day job, you're a scoutmaster, you launched your podcast, and at the same time, you also wrote your first book. How long did that take for you to get written?
Yeah, the first book took a while. It actually started from a Forbes article. I wrote an article, 5-6 years ago about FIRST robotics. A lot of my ideas come from PR people who want to get their particular clients, on the page of the Forbes. So understandably, and that's where that one came from. But along the way of doing it, so I got connected up with the founder of FIRST. It's Dean Kamen, who invented the Segway,
Right.
Serial inventor and entrepreneur, very incredibly brilliant guy. And we're just chatting about robotics. And I made the point, hey, I'm aware of these programs. I'm not an expert by any means. I know our community I live in has a pretty good program. And he's like, oh, where do you live? And I said, I live in Granville, Michigan. And there was a very uncharacteristic silence from Dean. He's not one to go quiet normally, but he did there for a moment. And then slowly he says, well, no, you don't have a pretty good program. You've got maybe the world's best program.
Wow.
So maybe you ought to go talk to your coaches. And so I went looking, got connected up with the head coach, a guy named Doug Hepfer, and interviewed him for the article and, put that out there and went along my merry way. Well, another year and a half goes by and Doug came back to me and said, Mike Evely, my fellow coach, and I think our story should be a book and we want help writing it.
Neat.
And so we got together then. And at the time, they wanted to get it done in a big hurry. They had a new school we were building here in the community, a new middle school where they put in what is the most amazing robotics center you will ever lay eyes on. And they were wanting to get it done before that grand opening. And we worked, and I thought we were going to make it, but we got right to the deadline and weren't quite there. And then it just kind of went into hibernation mode for a while. And we'd trade notes every so often. Didn't make a lot of progress. And it was literally a couple of years of doing, on my end, not a heck of a lot of anything. I had done a lot of upfront writing and, again, had the book mostly done. But then last fall, they came back and said, yeah, we've developed the last couple of chapters. Let's get back together and get it out there. And it was back into full court press mode, and got it published in January.
There are neat stories about those programs. A friend of mine, Dan Alford from Houston, runs ARC Specialties. He's actually been a guest on this show as well. And he's primarily in the welding automation space, but not exclusively. Does a ton with robots for a variety of different applications. And it contributes really an incredible amount of resources, money and time and advice and inspiration to several programs in his area. It's neat stuff.
It's amazing. I got to do that very quick and hands-on kind of learning about what our local program was doing. And from that, got to learn the broader robotics, academic robotics world. And it's phenomenal stuff. We talk a lot about skilled trades, but there's a whole other angle of getting youth involved in STEM and technical pursuits that is just irreplaceable now.
Right. So this idea of mentoring young people seems to tie in with this serious commitment you have to Boy Scouts. Talk about your association with Scouts.
Yeah, so I've got 2 sons, and before they were born, I read an article that just explicitly said, if you have boys, get them into scouting. And I just filed that away for the future and thought about it once they were born. And then my older son, when he got to the age where it was time for Cub Scouts, got him enrolled in it. And the first meeting, the den leader for his den announced that she needed an assistant den leader. So I raised my hand, and it just took off from there. Oh. Her son wound up quitting the next year, so I became den leader the following year, was den leader for that son where we lived at the time. We moved to Michigan kind of in the middle of his Cub career. My younger son was just getting started, and it so happened that where we moved, my older son's den already had a leader, but my younger son's new den didn't. So took over that one, had them all the way through their Cub career. As I got to the end of my Cub days, the scoutmaster we had at the time announced that he was stepping down and approached me and said, "You're the guy. You want to take over?" So I did. And yeah, spent 4 years through most of both of my sons' time in the troop, and just stepped down a year and a half, 2 years ago. I'm still an assistant scoutmaster. In fact, I'm leading a high adventure sailing trip the week after next with my younger son. My older one and I did it 6 years ago, so I get to go back and sail.
That's neat.
Lake Michigan and Lake Huron on the Retriever, the Scouts 52-foot catch.
I'm sure that creates a lot of great memories. I'm sure you have
some
with your older son.
Yeah. I hear about people who get so caught up in work and their pursuits, they miss out on what their kids have done. And scouting has just always been central to what the boys and I have done as they've grown up. And they've had other pursuits. I've tried to support those the best I can, but that one constant's always been Scouts.
Do Scouts have a robotics badge now?
I don't think so.
It feels like it might be an interesting addition.
I have to look that up. I haven't paid too much attention to merit badges here in the last year or two because both my sons have progressed to where they're not picking up. Yeah, I'll look at that. That's a really great point. If they don't, they should.
So maybe I'm imagining a connection, but Scouts and manufacturing, particularly manufacturing in the kind of family-owned, privately held company, the stories you highlight where it's the anchor employer in a community, they both feel like vestiges of something we might have thought of kind of a simpler, better world. Is that just a romantic view that I have through the patina of time, or do you think there's a connection there?
I think there is an element of romance to that is a very positive one. And I think it goes to that hands-on doing.
Right.
It's similar to the trades discussion as well. The fundamentals march together around someone's got to be in there making things, doing things, being in the real world. You have all this talk about a service economy, but a service economy can't make anything, right?
Right.
The manufacturing is going to happen somewhere. We've allowed too much of it to go away, and we need to bring it back. And I would submit that similarly, scouting has been kind of this anchor originally for boys. Now it's boys and girls, but it's been this anchor around that real world pursuit of skills and abilities and challenges. I mean,
And higher values and virtue and other things.
Yes, virtue. I'm glad you said that. I mean, it remains a religiously affiliated, not overt religious organization, but throughout scouting are discussions of your duty to God and how you apply that in your day-to-day life. And so it's important. And I think it is just anchoring, like you said, kids to those things that might be difficult and might not necessarily be what they would pursue on their own if, left to their devices. Sure. Now, today devices is way too literal because they're all on screens all the time.
Right.
And so that's one thing I think has been a huge positive in recent years is scouting gets them away from that and gets them out into the woods and out in a tent or in the rain, in the cold. I love how my predecessor, a scoutmaster at our troop, said it. He said, our scouts have gone hungry, but nobody has starved. Our scouts have been cold, but nobody has frozen.
Right.
And that's the thing. We'll let them be uncomfortable, and we'll be uncomfortable right there with them as adult leaders.
Sure.
But they're the ones leading those activities. And if you're uncomfortable, there's a reason for it, and you learn from it. And maybe next time you're not quite so uncomfortable.
Speaking of learning, you're also a history buff. Any kind of history that you're particularly into?
World War II is my number one focus. I love history overall, but from, almost the time I can remember, I came across some books about World War II as a kid in our local library, and that's just been kind of a real focus for me throughout my life.
I live about 15 minutes from the Patton estate, and every July there's a military day. So obviously a very strong theme of World War II. I mean, across different conflicts, but there's a kind of an interesting historical association here.
Yeah, I mean, what Patton did across Europe after we broke out from D-Day that's the stuff of legend.
Right. Back to policy, you're willing to tackle kind of maybe some third rail topics in your writing and podcast. You tell great stories about accomplishments of manufacturers, but you also talk about the burden of regulation and how government can really impinge on manufacturing. Do you get a lot of hate and criticism for that, or are people silent, or do you get a lot of positive feedback?
It's a great question. I hadn't really thought too deeply about that till you asked it. I don't get a lot of hate.
Well,
I get some good challenges. I get some people who are adamant that I'm wrong-headed and will endlessly list the reasons why. And, the ones who have value add to the discussion. The ones who don't won't hear the other side.
Right.
And so I just walk away from those discussions because they're not discussions at all. They're just sermons.
Right.
But I think a lot of people are coming to realize that there have been these ideas promulgated in recent years that reality has shown, some of them are just outlandish, but even some that, may well have some basis in reality aren't quite as dire or as in desperate need for our investment as they're held out to be.
Right.
And so I think there are people who, by virtue of seeing those predictions not come to pass, for example, have realized, maybe we should be discussing these things a little more upfront and being a little wiser about where we're pouring our increasingly debt-driven dollars.
One of your most read articles on Forbes talked about the impact of the German government's energy policy, and then the resulting high energy costs and the impact on their celebrated industrial base. Have you read the book Kaput that was recently published?
I haven't.
It talks about, I don't necessarily agree with the premise. I mean, it says the biggest problem German manufacturing has is they didn't embrace EVs early enough. I think embracing EVs actually eviscerated German manufacturing. But it also talks about the peculiarities of the banking system. It talks about Schroeder's, after he left office, how he established such close ties with the Russians and Gazprom and created a lot of the problems that then have led to the energy crisis and pricing in Germany. Maybe worth a read. It's an interesting read.
I definitely want to check that out. I've done quite a bit of reading on that because to me, Germany and I think UK as well are canaries in the coal mine of kind of the net zero ideal that's held out and what its reality becomes.
Right.
And there's now ample evidence of where that leads. And yet not a lot of backpedaling yet in either of those countries around getting back to sensible policy. And, the sadly silver lining for America is we're getting business from those two countries because of them driving their manufacturers away.
But we also have this huge advantage. Our natural gas prices are among the lowest in the world. And for any energy-intensive manufacturing, that's a huge tailwind that we have. It doesn't feel like we have leveraged it as well as we could have.
Well, yeah, and there's a lot of work yet to be done. I think the current administration has made a lot of positive moves to back us away from a precipice that we were approaching kind of right, behind the UK and Germany doing the same things. And now we've backed away from that. But still, federal policy isn't where it needs to be. We've not even begun the radical deregulation I think we need to do to get industry back on track. And then state by state is a continued disaster. Half the states basically still have the Biden administration policies. Michigan, where I am, being one of them.
Well, Massachusetts, where I am. I mean, our energy costs are nuts. I talk to friends that live in the TVA area that have incredibly affordable energy, and it's obvious why a lot of industries are moving there. And of course, the tax rates and tax incentives and environmental regulation and everything else. I mean, I talked to a friend yesterday who told me that they had an issue where they built a greenfield facility as a complement to an existing facility. The state regulators decided that because they had common ownership, even though they were in different locations, they were going to be treated as a campus. And therefore, the grandfathered existing location was going to have to be completely refabbed to meet the new regulations. I mean, it was almost untenable for them.
Yep. Yeah. Well, and again, there's a bit of a la land aspect to policymaking, unfortunately, and it's going to take a lot more people being as vocal as I am to start to turn that around. And so far, we don't have that.
And I believe also when we hear about factories closing, I mean, in the Northeast, we have a lot of factories close and workers are laid off and the factories are moved, not necessarily overseas, but to other places in the U.S. I had a client that did devices around bag houses and air quality monitoring and learned a lot about the reality they faced often. And other clients that sell equipment, particularly in the food plants, find projects are stymied because the plant is grandfathered. Nobody wants to redo the air permit, and any sort of a substantive change, adding a new line or something, would require it. And so they just let the plants essentially age and die in place and then go build a greenfield one as a replacement.
Yeah, it's crazy. And you'd think with the experience we've had in the Rust Belt that we'd be re-evaluating some of that direction. But too many states so far are just going down the same path.
You mentioned your libertarian streak, and it's evident in your body of work. I know you spent some time at George Mason. Did you end up at George Mason because of the libertarian economics view, or did GMU shape that view for you?
I landed there because of it. There was one of the very earliest online courses offered back in 97, I believe it was, out of George Mason in economics. And it was a unique take. It was evolution as economics, basically. So that kind of self-assembling order that you see in the economic world, mimicking what you see in the natural world. And it was phenomenal. It was led by a now friend of mine, a guy named Professor Howie Bacher, who's out of Towson. He's now retired, I believe, but he had gone to George Mason and did this class out of there. And it was just stupendous. You look at online classes today and they're still talking about how to do them effectively. In fact, I just was involved in a discussion about the failures of the COVID years around online education and how it didn't work in so many cases.
Right.
And the author of this post that I was responding to listed out a number of things that made for effective online education. And I commented, well, it's a shame they didn't get Howie involved because he had pretty much all these boxes ticked back in 97.
Wow.
So it was probably the most valuable course I have ever taken in my life.
That's fascinating.
And then became independent study for me really through the rest of my life. I continue to study economics and incorporate, I'm no expert, but incorporate the concepts from the experts in a way I think is meaningful for my manufacturing world.
What strikes me about the George Mason program is that Tyler Cowen, who I think is fairly Austrian, if I understand correctly, and I'm not an expert in this space, but he seems to be a fairly strong voice, though, against the idea of policy to reindustrialize. He tends to be in favor much more of these free markets, and if we become an entirely service-driven economy, that's okay because that's the natural way of things.
Yeah, there's a number of them in the libertarian and Austrian world with that idea, and I have been countering it because, again, it's this idealized view of the world, right. and it's like in their conceptual thinking, there's no such thing as dumping or insane subsidies to specifically target other countries' industries and drive them out of business. I mean, you look at, there's all this discussion of rare earths, and I've written extensively on rare earths. The previous manifestation of what's now MP Materials, Mountain Pass, out in California, was driven out of business by the Chinese, specifically targeting to drive that one last bastion of rare earths that America had out of business. And that kind of thing just doesn't exist in the libertarian world. Right. And it's that divorce, again, between the kind of sanitized ideal world of concept versus our real world that we actually live in, where people can be bad actors.
Well, we may be getting ready to watch the other end of that spectrum play out in New York City, the difference between beautiful theory and messy reality.
Except in that case, it's not beautiful theory whatsoever.
Well, I agree. True. So you're in the Rust Belt, as you mentioned. It seems like manufacturing is coming back to the upper Midwest, but it also seems more broadly distributed. I mean, I hear interesting stories from places I don't traditionally associate with manufacturing, Austin, Indy, others like that. Do you see, is this resurgence truly national, or is it focused in certain markets?
Right now, it's truly national. I think we run the risk of it becoming concentrated because of the policies that differ state to state and region by region. Right now, for example, Michigan is doing phenomenally with bringing industry back. And where I am in Grand Rapids is one of the fastest growing areas of the country. And a big chunk of that is bringing new industries in. And like you said, there's places that were never industrialized or very little industry in the past that are now becoming heavily industrialized. So I think because of kind of the groundswell of things coming back and growth in manufacturing right now, it's broadly based, but I just think there's going to be this natural sorting as the Trump administration continues to whittle away at some of the crazy policies and the blue states continue to double down on that insanity, that it will necessarily drive industries to the places where they're welcome.
Changing gears a little bit, for 3 years, as we talked about, you had 2 full-time jobs, basically. I'm always interested in people's workflow. Do you write early in the morning or at night? How do you keep consistency?
I mainly, during my day job phase, was writing at night. Again, I'm not a big sports guy and I don't watch a lot of television, so weeknights in particular would be writing time or researching time. So go from one job and grab some dinner, grab a workout, and then go to the other job.
Do the deadlines ever wear on you?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, there have been a number, and I don't have a huge commitment with Forbes. It started at 1 article a month, and I was, at that time, blowing that away because I wanted to get a big base of work.
You were doing 7 a month for quite a stretch there.
Well, yeah. It's now 2 a month, and 2 a month with everything else I have going on, even though I left my day job behind last fall, it's still a challenge. And like, I just published my second one for June on June 30. Wow. So that happens sometimes.
So a lot of stress in what you've done over the years. Being on a manufacturing floor is stressful. Deadlines are stressful. Is that where cycling comes in for you?
Oh, for sure.
Is
Yeah.
it
Now I've been a
mountain or
cyclist,
gravel or road or what?
road and mountain. So far I've resisted the gravel, even though I think it's a phenomenal, um, new addition to the cycling world. It's just, I have a couple of expensive bikes
Right.
and getting that third one hasn't been a super priority. Um, but yeah, I mean, I got into cycling when I was 13 years old.
Wow.
So long before I necessarily needed stress relief, but I consider it such a blessing. I always say if it weren't for cycling, I'd be as big as a house because I don't have the greatest diet, and otherwise, if I'm not cycling, I'm not doing a heck of a lot more. But
How many miles a
um,
year?
oh geez, I don't know what I'm doing now. Probably a few thousand.
I took my bike off the road when I get hit for the third time. I put it on a trainer in
Mm,
the garage, and I use Swift, which is good because it's
yeah.
relatively flat where we are, so I do more elevation. But I do miss
Yep.
being outside. I've thought about trying to get a gravel bike. I like the fact I could send my last email, put on my shoes, open the garage door, and start as opposed to driving somewhere.
Well, I'll tell you, I got huge into mountain biking in the kind of turn of the century years. Um, when my kids were born in '05 and '08, I didn't touch the mountain bike again until just 4 or 5 years ago
Hmm.
for that very reason. Even road biking became a challenge. I actually got into running, specifically for the efficiency of it.
Right.
And then I also had learned that having just all non contact uh, efforts was actually not ideal because you don't get that jarring your body needs. And sure enough, when I started running, I was a pretty brittle 40-year-old. And by the time I ran a few marathons, I was pretty well back on track.
Have you
And now mountain biking is doing that for me.
have you tried rucking?
I have. I actually talked about that with Mike Rowe.
Oh, really?
He's big into that. I got in a friend of mine mentioned it to me probably 8 years ago, and I looked at it then and didn't do anything with it. But then, as running fell away, running was my main winter activity here in Michigan. I try not to bike outside
Sure.
when it's snowy, and I hate the trainer myself, so I'll do it, but grudgingly so. And so I came back to rucking about 3 or 4 years ago, and it's now totally my main focus
Wow.
during winter. And last winter, I had it as my target and achieved it right as my rucking season ended. I did 10 miles with a 60-pound pack.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, typically, I just do 30 pounds. My 60 and 100-pound rucksack days are behind me. They were in the Army, but 30
Yeah,
pounds does enough.
I
And
think I'm headed there myself.
so wrap up with biking in a second, but recording this July 2nd, I guess it is. I think the Tour de France starts on Saturday. Do you follow that? I mean, for me, I can't compute somebody doing 300 watts for 150 miles. I don't understand it.
Well, yeah, I've had a number of kind of educational moments when it comes to my ability versus the ability of the real stars. One of my earliest ones, I got into road racing right out of college, and just so happened I moved into a town in the middle of freaking nowhere, Mississippi, Columbus, Mississippi. No offense, loved it there. Thank you guys. But I mean, I wanted to start cycling, and I'm looking around. There's not even a decent bike shop in Columbus at the time. So I look over at Starkville, the college town 25 miles away, and there's what looks like a decent shop. So I go over there and talking to a guy who turns out to be the owner, told him what I'm up to. And he also turns out to be like racing guru. And he's like, "Where do you live?" And I said, "Over in Columbus." And he says, "Well, you got two of the best road cyclists in the Southeast US. So go look for them." I thought maybe he was kidding me, but no. Sure enough, one of my next rides, here come these two guys all kitted up, going the other way. They wave, I wave. Then they come back for me and haul me out and thrash. And I wound up training with those guys, and they made me as good a rider as I ever was. But like even at my very best, the better of those two one day rode me on a flat road with no wind right off his wheel.
Wow. I think of doing 200 watts for 20 miles as really kicking ass in my world, the way I do things. And as I was thinking about this conversation, I thought that's perhaps an interesting analogy to industrial content.
Yeah.
Because so many manufacturers think because they've published a blog post, which is really just a newsletter, that they're really kicking ass, and they don't realize what they could be doing and what the elite are doing and what the above average are doing.
Right.
Is that an apt analogy, do you think?
I think so. Yeah. There are two things to it. Number one is you're going to get out of it the effort you put in. And I think, it's another kind of value that comes out of my crazy pursuits like bicycle racing and stuff like that spill over into my day-to-day world and, have me doing the crazy things of, writing for Forbes and establishing a web show and podcast and blah, blah, blah. And then fighting like heck to make them, some of the premier things out there.
Right.
But the other thing too is natural ability is real. And so if you don't have it to deliver the goods you want, you better go find it.
I just talked to Marcus Sheridan, who wrote Endless Customers. He was on the last episode of this, and he suggests that a small industrial manufacturer, say $5 million of revenue, needs a marketing department of at least 3 people, one of whom is a videographer. So, not somebody just trying to half-ass it with iMovie or something like that, but people that really know what they're doing. Like you say, talent and expertise.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned video. I did a few episodes of my own version of how it's made, and they did okay. It was just a kind of, try something different and see what kind of response I get. I think I did 4 or 5 episodes, and I did my own video. And then one of the shows, I was planning on going and visiting some friends of mine in my hometown in Ironwood, Michigan, the folks at Stormy Cromer, and it just didn't pan out for the trip. And so I asked him, hey, do you have video already that I could just piece together for this thing? And my friend there, Gina Thorson, sent me some B-roll video, and I put it together. And I was talking to a guy about a videographer back a few months ago, and I mentioned my shows and said, yeah, you ought to go check them out. I mean, they're amateur, don't expect much, but it was a cool pursuit. And we parted ways and we came back together the next day, and he's like, man, you really threw me there because, the first one I queued up was the Stormy Cromer thing. And I'm sitting there thinking, crap, if this guy thinks this is amateur, I'm in trouble. Wow. This is the one that was professionally done. There's a big difference.
Should more manufacturers have podcasts?
Yes and no. Again, if you're just doing it to doing it, I think it becomes just like you mentioned, the blog thing.
Right.
So many people start a blog because they've got the website and it's that bucket on the website. So they go throw out things. If you're not
at least
doing
they don't just leave the placeholders there, which I've seen on some websites.
Yeah. And if you're not doing it with an end in mind and with the right focus and professionalism, it's almost worse than not doing it at all.
Sure.
But that being said, I do think that we need a lot more voices raised in the manufacturing world to push back against crazy regulation, to talk about the skills gaps and some of the educational things we need and refocus people's priorities. So, boy, I think, if you have any inclination at all to do it, go do it.
But create a strategy first. Make sure you understand how you're going to do it to an adequate, quality in terms of production, so it's reflective of your brand and all that kind of thing.
Yeah, well, and so, I'm standing up my own consultancy here a few months into the idea, and really just now, I just posted on LinkedIn today the services I've thrown out there that I've just added to my writing business. So now it's Cosgrove Content and Consulting. I'm going to add to that. If you need help with just launching a podcast or a video series, I'm not the expert, but I can help you with the right approach and then direct you to the people who know.
So I'm sure that you get frequently the feedback that, no, what we talk about is our products. Our products are what's important. That's what people are interested in. I tend to be New England in my response and a bit abrasive and say nobody gives a shit about your products, which doesn't necessarily help people understand what I'm trying to convey to them. How do you answer in your kind of more genteel Midwestern way? How do you help people understand they need to actually talk about what matters to their buyer, not their products?
Probably not well all the time. I can get a little abrasive myself. People will talk about that. I've tried to be more tolerant in recent years and be more constructive. And I think that's definitely the right approach with it, is to say, here's why, and just try to lay it out for people. Again, going to that earlier comment, there are those people who don't want to hear what you have to say. And I don't waste my time with them.
Sure.
But I think most people are receptive, and I think becoming more so because of some of the difficulties we've encountered,
Right.
to hearing about different thoughts and correctives and things like that. So that's the way I try to kind of lay it out.
Everyone complains about recruiting and hiring, but I don't see a lot who visualize content as an important tool in addressing that. Do you?
Not at all. No. It'll be interesting to see what comes out of a lot of these kind of scattershot trades efforts. I think scattershot's okay, but given the gap we face, I do think, for example, a NAM, National Association of Manufacturers, has a part to play in helping address that. And I'm not seeing a lot yet. I have been happy with a lot of what I've been seeing out of NAM lately. So hopefully they'll pick that one up too, just to help try to pull all the disparate efforts together and set some common standards and goals.
And what are your thoughts on the confirmation of funding now for the MEPs? I was up in the air for a while.
So I stayed quiet. I stayed on the sidelines with that one. I'm gonna be honest. When it came up, I was tempted to throw out there, we are almost $37 trillion in debt, folks. And the notion that our federal government should be out there funding this stuff instead of manufacturers doing it for themselves is wrong-headed and is part of why we are where we are. I think pulling the funding, though, precipitously would have been a disaster. So what I think would be the right approach would be for us all to acknowledge it's not a function of the federal government. We need to reevaluate everything the feds are doing, because they should be doing a whole heck of a lot less,
Right.
And starting to whittle that debt down. We as industry should be funding the MEPs. So how do we make that happen? I think the mission they have is the right one, and I think they're delivering value, but it shouldn't be the general taxpayers paying for that. It should be us, because they're our advocates.
Mm-hmm. I've long argued that companies need to create their own publishing arm. They need to do it in-house. Along the lines of what Mark has talked about, I'm actually going to talk to the guy who founded Packaging World magazine and then sold it to PMMI. He's on an upcoming episode. But that's a bridge too far in many cases. If their marketing budget is a couple trade shows and a couple journal ads, and they've never written content, never thought about creating any significant number of videos on a regular basis, the idea of becoming a publisher just feels crazy. And I've suggested that it may be better to buy them. And I've talked in the private equity world about a sponsor when they acquire a platform company and think about their bolt-ons, that maybe a trade publisher in that space would be a great next bolt-on. But anyway, long-winded background of the question. I believe that it's often unrealistic to find outsiders who can write authoritatively for their buyers. Now, you may agree in principle, disagree in practice, because you actually do that. What are your thoughts? How long does it take you to get up to speed to actually be able to write authoritatively for a company?
Yeah, that last question is a thought-provoking one. I think to be effective at it definitely takes some work. I love the concept of having that ready-made platform that you're talking about, because then you're allowing another avenue of expertise to really serve that niche world.
Right.
I also like what you said up front, though. Companies need to have that in some regard for themselves. So I think the ideal maybe is that hybrid of having those companies like you're talking about that are specifically manufacturing oriented, serving the day-to-day needs, but each manufacturer having it as part of that PR side of things that we've got to be responsible for our own content creation and make it effective.
But you've got 30 years on manufacturing floors.
Yep.
I just don't see that it's realistic for no matter how bright and how good a writer, but a recent Smith or Vassar College graduate can't write with authority on industrial manufacturing, even at the business level, much less at the technical level.
Right. Yeah. The gurus from that content creation side can handle the nuts and bolts of that. It's going to take the industry expertise to bridge the gap.
Right.
Because you're right. There's no possible way someone not knowledgeable about what we do in manufacturing can be effective at communicating about it. And
So I've tried. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, so identifying those people who are effective communicators, and it's a challenge, again, going back to our very early part of this discussion, talking about the geeks in our world. Most geeks aren't necessarily great at writing and communicating. And so people like you and me have a little bit of advantage of having kind of the foot in both worlds.
I've even suggested companies, if they're not comfortable with the idea of becoming a publisher, at least hire a journalist, because a journalist is trained how to interview, how to research, how to take information, how to codify it into a thesis and build an argument around it with information they've gotten from people. But even that feels foreign for many companies.
One big plus coming down the pike, and it's becoming more effective by the day, is AI.
Sure.
So if you had a journalist coupled up with industry subject matter experts, I think AI can really play a huge role in bridging the gap and coming up with that created content that includes both sides.
Right. Do you see any increase in video scripts that you're writing, or are you still focused on articles and white papers and things?
I so far have not seen an increase in video. I've heard more discussion about it. So I think
about press releases.
Oh, I don't get too involved in that side of it. That becomes more the province of just the pure PR folks.
I see. Got it.
But yeah, the video stuff, it's almost like we're at the discussion point and it's getting ready to take off in a bigger way.
And how about in technology, partnerships are big. The idea that you can find adjacent technologies or adjacent companies, and you can use that to reach each other's audiences. I haven't found traction with manufacturers taking that approach. Have you seen anyone doing it?
No. Nope. I think the opportunity is huge, but so far not seeing. I'm like you. It's just not happening yet.
I guess speaking of partnerships, we both need to give a shout out to Matt Hareen at Variable with his Manufacturing Today podcast for introducing us. There's no formal partnership, but he's the one that connected us. We've both been on his show, and we're actually doing complimentary shows. I recorded with you a couple of days ago. You're recording with me. We'll publish them both next week. So thanks to Matt for connecting us.
And Matt had a phenomenal show that drops the day we're recording this one, talking about casting. So had a woman on who's an expert in the casting world. And I just wrote an article about a big casting program that IACME is doing in concert with Michigan Tech University. And so that one really caught my eye, and I immediately listened to the episode. So Matt continues to do phenomenal work.
Good. When does the new book come out?
I'm shooting for late summer, early fall. I'm at the end of my kind of original writing. So just a little background, it came out of a lot of my Forbes articles. I realized a couple of years ago, got all these stories of companies that, going back to what I told Amy, that first discussion about wanting to write about what Americans do. And man, it would be a great book. And then I started pulling together my favorite ones and realizing, I've heard about a bunch of other companies I want to include. So it's roughly half and half stories I had already written and new ones. So I'm almost done with the new writing. I've got one more article length thing that I need to put together as a chapter, and then do the final edits and updates, and shooting to have all that writing complete by the end of this month. And then I need to do a few other things to get it ready for launch, and shooting to,
So it'll be a
like
perfect
September,
Christmas gift for
October.
people to buy for each other.
Pardon?
Perfect Christmas gift. It'll hit the market in
That's what
time
I
for everybody to
think.
give it as a gift.
It's so cool because it's got so many phenomenal stories. Some of them are ones people have heard of, like Zamboni will, I think, always be my favorite story I've ever told. Just such phenomenal people and such a great history.
For people who aren't in a part of the country where there's ice hockey, Zamboni is the machine that drives around on the rink and cleans up the ice between periods.
Yeah, and the beauty is there's not much of the country that doesn't see ice hockey anymore, so it's
I
not
guess
quite
that's true,
as an unknown in the warm states as it used to be. But
Right.
Here's the thing: almost everyone's heard of Zamboni, but how many people know they started outside LA?
I didn't.
And so it's that kind of thing where it's a company you've heard of but don't know the whole story about, or companies you should know about and have never heard of. I mean, one of my most recent and favorite ones is Bevan Bells, the Bevan manufacturing folks in Connecticut. I had posted on LinkedIn a few months ago, hey, who are the unsung heroes of rock music manufacturing? And got some great suggestions.
Interesting.
But this one comes from my oldest brother on LinkedIn. He responds to my post. My brother John, so he just posts Bevan Bells and a link to the cowbell skit from Saturday Night Live. And so, of course, I immediately put together and realized, yeah, those are the folks that made the cowbell, sure enough. But also have been around since 1865, invented the first bicycle bell, did the bell that rang Angel Clarence his wings on It's a Wonderful Life, and just amazing history.
You ought to talk to Diana Huff. She does.
Oh, I do.
Oh, okay.
I
good.
do. Yeah. Good. She's one of my favorite people out there.
Good.
And doing great work on the Made in America stuff.
Absolutely.
Yeah. In fact, I just introduced her to the Fiesta tableware folks. So they're in my book. Fiestaware, the bright, colorful plates and dishes.
Right.
In my home state of West Virginia, where I was born, and just doing their thing and making wonderful stuff that's a cult classic.
Cool. So aside from your Forbes articles, your podcast, your books, etc., what podcasts, blogs, or YouTube channels do you suggest that folks follow?
Yours, for sure.
Well, that's kind of you and Diana's. We'll put Diana's on the list, and Matt Hurray's podcast.
And I'm not being glib. When Matt introduced us and I went out looking at your stuff, I'm like, holy cow, yeah, Matt hit the nail on the head here. I love running into folks where I feel like we're two peas in a pod, and definitely feel that with you. Matt's for sure. Matt, I think, has done the most amazing work of getting his up and running and meaningful in the shortest time ever.
I hope he has video soon.
Oh, I know. I get that that's a whole other level of complexity. You do too. But yeah, I think video is becoming the thing. And so
massive. Yep.
We'll have to drag him kicking and screaming to it. I actually don't listen to a lot of podcasts or watch a lot of shows.
Even while you're on the bike, you don't listen to podcasts?
I don't. I'm an old school guy. I believe you should have your ears open and listening for what's around you.
Sure.
Especially nowadays when everyone else around you is on their freaking cell phone.
Right.
And I still do a lot of road riding, so I've just never gotten into that. And of course, I have all my other stuff going on. But, I like the making chips guys, all that stuff in the whole machining world that I still know way too little about. I mean, right. I tout myself as an overall manufacturing expert, which means I'm a jack of all trades and master of very few. So they do great work. I think what Titan Gilroy does is phenomenal. He was one of my earliest Forbes articles, and he was, I did a 1-2 punch for my day one of my show, and he was one of the two, Amy Robbins from Alexo Athletica being the other. And she's got a new show. It's not manufacturing centered, but she is a bright, bright woman. Another one who's into public policy stuff, very much aligned with me. So I'll say there's a partisan angle there, but she is just such a breath of fresh air in the business world, doing what she does, got her own company and now her own show.
That's great.
Amazing woman.
I'm going to put your LinkedIn and your show website and your copywriting website and a link to your Forbes byline in the show notes. What's the best way for people to connect with you?
Yeah, LinkedIn, definitely connect with me there.
Only if they're ready to give you a writing contract for a big name journal?
Writing contract, I'm still in the early stages of being self-sufficient as an independent. So my consulting business is huge to me. So Jim at Vinoski.net, if you've got a need in the manufacturing world, whether it's continuous improvement programs that actually work and stick around, or a member of your board who's focused on growth and making a long-lived entity out of what you have going on, or writing continues to be a thing I do, content creation in the technical world, and coaching, leadership coaching. I came by it the hard way. I came out of the engineering world where a lot of folks try leadership and don't do so well, and I managed to be successful at it after a number of bad starts early on. So I think that has made me pretty darn effective as a executive and leadership coach in the manufacturing end of things.
Well, good. Hopefully you'll have some people connecting with you on LinkedIn to talk about those. So give us 3 minutes to wrap us up. What do manufacturers need to understand about content as they work to renew America's industrial base?
Well, the first thing is, why are you creating the content? So, it's one thing to create content to tout your own business and figure out then what the need is from your consumer, from your target audience. What do they need to know, and how does your content support that? Too many people fall into just talking about their history, talking about what they do versus what problem they're solving for the consumer, for the customer.
Right.
If you're into that broader world like Ed and I are, of helping get elevated voices from manufacturing into things like public policy discussion and the public eye direction of our country, then realize what that takes and how much more work it is to be effective at that, and buckle up and go for it, because we need the voices.
But it takes a ton of work, even if you're only doing it for your own brand.
That's right.
To do it well, do it consistently, do it right, bring in the outside expertise, create stuff that's meaningful for your market. It takes work. Absolutely.
But anything that delivers value does, right? Of course. So treat it just like you do your manufacturing business. You wouldn't give short shrift to making what you make. Same thing with your content.
All right, there's a mic drop moment right there. Perfect place for us to wrap up. Awesome conversation, Jim. Thank you so much for visiting with me.
Thank you, Ed. This has been phenomenal.
Good. Everyone listening,
we should mention, you were on my show, and so definitely go look for that, because Ed had some great points that he made when we recorded just a couple of days ago.
Cool. I'll drop that link in as well. Everyone listening, you know your part now. You know what you need to do. You got to like and share and comment. And by all means, please subscribe. If you comment, I promise you I'll read it. If you're not being too big a wise guy, or you're not talking about crypto, I'll even reply to it. So tune in next week for another episode of the Industrial Growth Institute podcast. And thanks so much for joining today.